Welcome to the Promise Not to Tell 2 series, educating school personnel on recognizing, responding, and reporting child physical abuse.
As school personnel, you have the unique opportunity to spend up to 30 hours a week with children, having more contact with children than even parents at times. This opportunity allows you to be a mentor, role model, and safe place for children. In this role, you may be the one person who recognizes abuse or the potential for abuse. It is our intent through this video series to provide you with the tools and information necessary to recognize, report, and respond to child physical abuse.
Physical abuse happens with greater frequency and is really one of the more common forms of referrals for investigation. The thing that teachers might see is outward marks on a child or some sort of physical manifestations, and things such as bruises, particularly bruises around the head or face. We do know that very often bruising behind the ears is a telltale sign of maltreatment and physical abuse. Linear marks that suggest rope burns, whips, belts. We know that in one form of physical abuse is excessively harsh discipline. And so a child may have marks that imply that they were struck with an object. Handprints, the hands across the face will often leave telltale linear marks, 2 or 3 marks across. In a smaller child, that may take up the whole side of the head or the whole side of the face. So we're concerned about any form of physical discipline that leaves marks on a child. Other things that can be signs of physical abuse include burns. In some situations, caregivers might use a burn as a way to discipline a child. We sometimes see bites. Now, especially in younger kids, they will bite each other, and we don't certainly want to imply that all bite marks are maltreatment, but bite marks that imply, that look larger, that look like they might be adult size, so bite marks, burns, bruises. The unfortunate thing, there are other signs of physical abuse that might not be as obvious. And we know kids that have head injuries or might be assaulted in some physical way may come to school seemingly unresponsive, may be confused, may not be as alert as usual. Occasionally, physical abuse presents with a seizure disorder in a classroom because the child may have some brain injury. Another form of abuse is abdominal injury, and that's one of the more concerning forms of physical abuse because we don't often see outward manifestations. That area of the body is covered by clothing, but abdominal injuries can be extremely life-threatening and can be easily missed. And so it's important perhaps to look for injuries on the back, injuries in the abdominal area. When we do exams, we need to examine the entire child. We need to take off their clothing and look for them. Obviously, that may not be something you do in the classroom, but if there's a suspicion, what we really want to stress is that these get reported and referred, and that we get an opportunity to have this child seen in a medical setting to determine the nature of the injury. One thing I would be concerned is if there are different stories about the injury on different days, or if the child told Mrs. X in the morning that they fell down the stairs, but they told Mr. Y in the afternoon that their brother pushed them down. Inconsistent mechanisms of injury or reported methods for how the injury occur is often a sign that the child is reticent to tell the truth, or perhaps has been coached to say something. But kids aren't good at remembering what it is they might be supposed to say, so inconsistency in how the injury occurred through the day or even over multiple days. Another is delay in seeking treatment. Very often, if a child presents with a burn that looks to you like it's perhaps not been addressed in a medical setting, burns are very important to treat and prevent infections and heal much better with treatment. So that can be a sign that the caregivers may be reticent to take the child to a medical setting to have that addressed. And so both inconsistent stories as well as delay in seeking medical treatment for physical injuries can be signs of maltreatment. Children who have extensive needs, such as children who might have cerebral palsy, children who might have autism, children who may have diabetes or even have severe prematurity with visual problems. The literature would tell us that children with special needs are at increased risk of both neglect as well as physical abuse. And it relates to that issue of caregiver stress. And those kinds of children often demand a lot from their caregivers. They can be very exhausting to care for. They can require around-the-clock care. And sometimes our system isn't good at supporting these families, and we don't often provide them with the respite that they might need to take a break. And so exhausted caregivers combined with children with intense need does increase the risk of physical abuse.
Some of the behavioral indicators in the classroom that we see at our school are kids that often come in tardy or are absent, and the parents don't have an explanation for that absence or tardy. Oftentimes we will see kids come in with long sleeve shirts or high collared shirts when it's really warm outside, and that's usually a red flag or a sign.
Some of the things that aren't quite so obvious are the behavioral indicators, and those can be actually on a very wide and diverse spectrum. Some kids will withdraw and avoid interaction and contact, and some kids will act out. And what we typically see is that it often follows gender lines. Child physical abuse can have a significant impact on learning and behavior at school, and I think teachers just need to be aware that those can look very different. If children are being harmed at home or at risk of being harmed at home, oftentimes their attention and their concentration is going to be affected. So they may look like they're inattentive, they may look a little non-compliant, or they may act out some of the behaviors that they're experiencing or seeing at home too. So they may be aggressive in the classroom, they may be non-compliant, not following instructions.
There are those who might be reticent to make referrals because they have this inappropriate assumption that if I make a referral, they'll immediately remove that child from their family. And the goal of the system is not to separate children from their families. Kids belong with their mothers and fathers. And so the initial interventions would be to determine what happened, why did it happen, and what can we do to ensure that this child is safe and raised in an environment with at least acceptable and minimal nurturance and concern. And so very few out of referrals, 8 out of 10 are not removed, so the majority. And I like to think of a referral to CPS as an opportunity to assist a family. And so
school personnel have the option to call law enforcement, social services, or the county attorney's office if they suspect that a child is being physically abused. They don't have to have physical proof. They don't have to have the child actually tell them, my dad grabbed me by the arm and threw me against a wall, for instance, in order to report that. The Kentucky law allows them to make reportings on suspicion as long as they can articulate why they suspect that that child has suffered physical abuse. So as long as they can articulate the reasons they're reporting it, they are okay. Kentucky law will protect them.
Reports of child abuse and neglect may be made to a local or state police department, Commonwealth Attorney, County Attorney, or the Department for Community-Based Services Child Reporting Hotline. The Child Abuse Reporting Hotline is 1-877-KY-SAFE-1 or 597-2331. Prior to placing your call, you will need to have the following information: the child's identity, any person believed to be responsible for the abuse or neglect, if the person is known, the nature and extent of the abuse or neglect, the name and address of the reporter, you may remain anonymous, and where the child can be found. If the child is in immediate danger, please call 911.
If a teacher or another staff member at a school suspects physical abuse of a child, they need to contact the Department for Community-Based Services. Protocol within each school may be a little different. Teachers may be asked to report to the principal or PSA that they have a suspicion. The two can then make the referral together. What happens is if a teacher suspects abuse and reports it to the principal, they both have the obligation to call Community-Based Services and make the referral. I'm not sure, as I said, some schools are different. We prefer that parents are not contacted prior to or after contacting us until we have a chance to interview the child, just to ensure that child's safety. It's important when you're calling in, I'd like for teachers to call in. If you find something with your child in the morning, to go ahead and make that call as soon as possible. We'd like to see the child before they go home from school that day. The teacher should be prepared when calling in a report to DCBS to give what the child said. It's important to document rather than paraphrase what the child said. For instance, you know, I've had teachers who've called and said, well, this child reported that he was spanked with a belt, and when I go out there, it turns out that that's not exactly right. The child was spanked maybe, but, you know, so it's very important to be accurate when you give a referral. If a teacher makes a referral, or a librarian or any other school personnel make a referral, I would appreciate, and I'm sure my coworkers would appreciate, if that teacher would leave her name and number. It's important to know that this is protected by law. I'm never going to say the teacher called this in. Now, a lot of times people guess, but it's important for the teacher to feel comfortable to call that in and leave her name and number, or his name and number, so that I can call them back and say, okay, well, can you tell me a little bit more about this child? And that may be when I say, have you noticed anything different with this child lately? Just kind of get some more information about what's gone on in the child's history too. So I would appreciate interviewing the teacher. The other thing that I would highly suggest is that you document yourself for your own purposes. Document who you talked to in the school. You know, if you went to the principal, if you went to the PSA, who you talked to in the school, and then document the time and date of your call to social services and who you talked to there.
Just because an initial report has been made by the school suspecting physical abuse of a child doesn't mean that they should not report future incidents that they may suspect. We might not have been able to prove that first report, but each time, if that child shows up every third week with a black eye, that second time they show up to school with a black eye and have no reasonable explanation for how that injury happened, or common sense indicates to that school person that something's not right with this, they need to pick that phone up and call again.
When someone calls in a referral and they're frustrated, maybe they've called in several referrals about a child and they feel like nothing's being done, I would encourage them to call and just say that, you know, I've called in several referrals. Is there somebody there I can talk to? I've just got a lot of concerns about this child. Everybody in Central Intake is a clinician level social worker with the cabinet. If you don't get satisfaction there, you know, you can call, ask to speak to the supervisor in centralized intake. Just keep going until you're satisfied. I had a teacher just last week call me, and I could feel in her voice just how passionate she was about this child and how really worried she was about this child. So she told me, I'm not hanging up the phone until I talk to a supervisor, and I don't care who it is. And that's fine. I found her a supervisor, because we need to all be in this together, every single one of us on the same team.
Everybody, including teachers, when they have reasonable cause to believe that a child is dependent, neglected, or abused, that they make a report to local law enforcement, Kentucky State Police, the cabinet, county attorney, or the Commonwealth attorney. And they're not relieved of that responsibility by merely reporting it to their supervisor. The supervisor has the same responsibility. Once that report is made to them, they've got the same people that they need to notify. There's a reported case in Kentucky, Allen versus Commonwealth, where that's what happened. A teacher and a counselor receive information that a child is being abused. They report that pursuant to the school policy to the principal, and later they wind up being charged with the crime of failure to report because they didn't report it as required by the statute. So the Supreme Court ruled that even though that was the policy within the school system at the time, and they complied with that policy, that they didn't comply with the statute. So they still faced the penalties that are in place within that statute. For the first offense of failure to report, it's a Class B misdemeanor, which is punishable by a fine and up to 90 days in the county jail.
If a teacher is concerned about reports, I think the best thing we can educate teachers on is that you don't have to be concerned about going to court and point to somebody and say, he did this to a child, because you don't know who did it. That's up to the Commonwealth, and they're not going to call you in to do that. It's going to be other proof that convicts a person. The person who actually saw it, person who gave a statement who did it, and gave a statement of other excuses and whatever they may do to try to get out of it. In child abuse cases, teachers who actually file the initial report, in my opinion, are very seldom used as far as testifying in court. And it's not because they don't want to use teachers, but the teacher has no idea who actually did this. They don't know when it was done, who else may have been involved. Biggest motivation is you don't have to be concerned about your own welfare, but always be concerned about the welfare of the children in your classroom.
Sometimes I think when teachers are considering whether to report, we factor a lot of things in, maybe socioeconomic status, maybe race. Maybe they just can't imagine that somebody they've known throughout the years, this child's parent, is capable or able of hurting their child. You know, sadly, physical abuse of children cuts across all socioeconomic levels. It cuts across all races, genders, religious preferences. Again, if you have a suspicion that a child is being hurt, you may be the one person who sees this child 30 hours a week. You could be the one person who calls in and makes such a big difference in this child.
One case in particular that I oversaw or tried, you know, I think that probably abuse had been going on for a few months since the daughter had been with her father, and I think she may have been with him for about a couple of years, and eventually she was dead. And I just wonder if somebody should have seen something, if somebody should have questioned that. I don't know. I wasn't there. But it just makes you wonder if that could have been prevented, if somebody was alert and saw that this child's something is not exactly right and we need to try to get some help. So just always be aware. And
it's important to remember child abuse crosses all economic, racial, ethnic, and religious boundaries. It is a myth that child abuse occurs only among poor families or is more likely to occur in any particular ethnic group. Child abuse knows no boundaries.
Well, I think there's several things that a teacher can do to respond to children when they come to them reporting some type of abuse. One is, the first thing is to believe them and not to show any emotional distress or alarm about it, but just to handle it very calmly, to let the child know that it's not their fault and that they're going to do everything they can in their power to get the kind of help they need. Teachers can only report and that we don't really have any control over what happens as a result of that report. So we don't want to promise to kids that everything will be all right, because it might not be. But we can let them know that I will call the authorities and I will do whatever I can in my power to let the agencies know that this is going on and that you're having some problems and that there's some unsafe things going on in your house. But we can't really control what happens after that.
I think a lot of people wonder what the best response is to a child who's just disclosed. And I think the worst thing that any person can do, be it a teacher or just a civilian, would be to gasp in horror and non-belief. That often shuts children down very quickly, and sometimes they perceive that the adult that they've attempted to disclose to can't tolerate their experience. And sometimes children will want to protect the adults, and so they won't share anything else. So my best recommendation would be for teachers to say to children when they've just disclosed, you're very brave, and I'm really proud of the way that you've chosen to share with me, and I'm glad that you trust me enough to share this information with me. And to allow the child to disclose as much as possible without leading. Again, once the child is disclosed, number one, always believe the child. I think there's often a fear of false accusations coming from children or even other caregivers who are antagonistic for one reason or another. But number one, definitely believe the child and definitely treat it seriously. The worst thing that you could happen is pretend like nothing has happened and that the child never told you. They will again be reinforced that here's another caregiver who won't keep me safe and who I can't trust.
When a teacher is talking to a child about what they suspect is child physical abuse, it's important to get as many details as possible without saying, did your dad do this? Did your mom do this? Did Uncle so-and-so do this? It's important to let the child speak for themselves. You can, as a teaching professional, you know that you can lead a child in any direction that you want to lead them into, basically. So just stick to basic questions. It's not necessary to confirm that abuse occurred in order to contact social services. That's going to be what we do. It's just all the teacher has to have is the suspicion. It's important not to ask a lot of yes or no questions with children. Law enforcement receives a copy of every single referral that comes in to the cabinet. It's automatically generated and sent to them. The sergeant or whoever's in charge of the Crimes Against Children or Special Victims Unit of that agency will review that, and they make a decision sometimes to go ahead and come out with us and do a joint investigation from the beginning.
The role of law enforcement in a child physical abuse case is to investigate to determine if any criminal action has occurred. We'll interview all the parties that are involved, determine if there's any physical evidence, any injuries to the child, and then based on what Kentucky law allows, we will present our findings to the court. Well, once the report has been made, depending on what the report entails, if the child revealed information, if there's an obvious physical injury, several things could occur. They might see the law enforcement arrive and remove the child from school, especially if immediate medical care is needed. We may come to school and interview the child in the school setting, in a private room there at the school. They may not see anything. Our job is to conduct an investigation, law enforcement, and we work hand in hand with social services in a number of these cases. And our job is to make it as unintimidating to the child as possible. So if we know we can interview that child outside of the school setting, our goal is to conduct an interview with that child where they feel most comfortable. That may be school, that may be social services, that may be the state police post. It may be in the home. If it was someone abusing that child that maybe doesn't live in the home of that child. So really, the most important thing that they need to realize is that they may or may not hear from us. Once the investigation has begun and there's been a decision to remove that child from the home, we will notify school personnel that those parents are no longer able to come and pick that child up. In the event we remove a child immediately from the school setting and we are unable to make notification to those parents prior to the end of the school day, or the parent happens to show up at school wanting to check out their student from the school, and the school system is there one-on-one with the parent, what they need to do is immediately call law enforcement. Get the parents into a room. Try not to let them leave, but if they're going to leave, don't hold them. But just explain to them that you're not the right person for them to be talking to. You're going to be calling law enforcement. Law enforcement will need to talk to them. We're going to, they'll be here in a few minutes. Have a seat in this room. School personnel really need to minimize their involvement. They didn't remove that child. They had nothing to do with that child being removed. Law enforcement came and removed that child from the school environment. And so the issue that the parents have is with law enforcement, not with that school. So the best thing that school personnel can do, really the only thing they need to do, is to refer them to the law enforcement agency that removed that child.
What's interesting in doing investigations is there's such a fine line between what the referral source, what information the referral source can get back, because at the same time we're trying to protect the parents' confidentiality as well. Certainly a teacher has an interest in that child. Certainly they want to know, was this investigated? Have you guys looked into this? The teacher should know before they ever hang up whether the referrals are going to be accepted. So that should ease their mind quite a bit. Sometimes when a child tells a teacher or someone else that they trust at school that something bad has happened to them at home, by the time a social worker comes out to see them, they may have started to think in their hearts, in their minds, I'm going to get my mom or dad in trouble, I'm going to get my aunt or uncle in trouble. It's very natural for that child to become afraid and to take back what they said. And if that happens, You know, we'll continue to come out. Anytime there's a suspicion, we'll continue to come out. We can really only work on what that child says. Now, if there are siblings, we're obligated to interview every child in that family. So we'll go person to person, kind of compare stories. But it's very natural for a child to recant. We can't replace their biological family. It's their parent, it's their family, it's who they belong to, it's who their identity comes from. So they are going to protect them. We find that a lot. Children will protect their parents. When we come out, they'll say, I'm not talking to strangers. I'm not talking to child services. It's amazing what kids have seen on TV and what they've heard from other kids that make them afraid of us. That's why I go back to, if you as a teacher would say, I've got my friend coming out and they just want to talk to you a few minutes and make sure that things are going okay in your family. Ultimately, the goal is to make that child safe.
After a teacher reports or discloses some information to me, and then she reports it to the cabinet or Child Protective Services, I always reiterate the importance of letting the school personnel, the administrators, or someone in the Family Resource Center, if that child is absent the next day or the teacher has known that that social worker has gone out and visited. We always want to make sure and err on the side of caution to make sure that that child is safe after the child has disclosed. If the child is absent after the child has disclosed and say the teacher knows that the social worker has gone out to the home, my response to the teacher has always been to make sure that they report that to the cabinet, whether it's to the social worker that they are working with, the ongoing worker, or it's just to go ahead and call in a new report so that child is checked on that day. There's a lot of ways that kids lose ground whenever we feel that they are being abused. They usually lose ground 3 ways: academically, socially, and behaviorally. Academically, poor concentration. Socially, they can't make friends. It's really tough for them. Behaviorally, could be acts of aggression, or maybe they're shy or withdrawn.
Some of the impacts of child abuse in the short term, obviously, the physical injuries can be minor or be very pervasive. They can result in a loss of attendance at school. They can result in poor academic grades and really interfere with their studies. Some of the longer-term effects result in relational issues with kids and adults and an inability to trust caregivers.
In terms of how physical abuse can affect a child, we do in the mental health community have some diagnosis we make, and post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition that when you think about, you might think of those in war situations or veterans, but we do know that children who are subjected to violence, either perpetrated upon themselves or exposed to domestic violence that causes them to be afraid and fearful, can develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And the hallmark symptoms of that include re-experiencing the actual maltreatment in other times and places. So there may be situations where a man's voice would trigger a reminder, even unconsciously, of that child, of the perpetrator. And so you might see this exaggerated response to a male voice. Another hallmark of post-traumatic stress is hypervigilance and hyperarousal. Those are 2 different terms we use. Hypervigilance is kids who have exaggerated startle responses, kids who are very much frequently scanning the environment for threat. They may appear on edge. That hyperarousal might look like impulsivity, and so they might be up and moving around. It can look a little bit like ADHD, and so we do sometimes have a hard time sorting out what's hyperarousal and hypervigilance from other conditions that may coexist. But it is important to recognize that trauma triggers can cause these children to look very regressed. And in its worst forms, kids will dissociate. And what dissociate means is that as a method of coping with severe trauma, sometimes kids develop a way in their own mind to go away. They go away in their mind somewhere else, and they're not physically present, emotionally or mentally present during the actual maltreatment. And so they have this blank stare.
Some of the things that some of our teachers have done in the past is whenever a child is exposed to any kind of abuse, we try to set up some kind of feelings barometer for them to have maybe on the desk, something that's not going to stand out to the other students, but they can kind of alert the teachers and say, you know, I'm feeling really sad today, or I'm feeling really bad, thinking a lot about what's happened with the abuse.
What's very important in a classroom setting is that we not say, oh, this is a very damaged, very injured child, and so we should let them do whatever they want, and oh, isn't that sad, and let's, you know, put them over here and not have any expectations of them. Because children, when people don't expect anything from them, they get worried. Well, maybe I'm not okay. Mrs. Smith used to make me do my homework. All of a sudden, she doesn't care whether I turn in my homework. Now, some kids might say, woohoo, you know, but unconsciously or consciously, kids who are suddenly treated as fragile and somehow there are no limits set, or we get ourselves in the situation where we're afraid to set a limit because of the reaction, that can create anxiety in a child because they realize, hey, I'm being treated differently than everyone. So schools really need a plan to deal with these kids. They need to, at some level, at least understand that they're in treatment. As you well know, teachers may be asking, therapists may be asking for feedback about their behavior. They might require a specialized behavioral plan. But we do need to very quickly try to normalize their existence. People don't realize that you could be a very important figure in their life. You might be the one person who doesn't yell, who doesn't react angrily when they misbehave. And so this is how we help kids get better, is that they need to learn that all adults don't hurt people, and that they're...
Family Resource Centers provides many services for our at-risk families and for our children who have suffered abuse. One of the things that we do is we do a lot of prevention programs for our families, and that's just talking about effective discipline, appropriate discipline, effective communication, parenting programs for our dads. We're doing a fatherhood series right now, and dads are actually coming into our school and learning how they were disciplined and how they can better discipline their children by using appropriate discipline. Other things that we do is we work with area agencies on making sure that we bring the information about shaken baby syndrome at a community baby shower. We talk about developmental stages for the kids so parents understand. We provide classes for stress for our parents. We teach them how not to be stressed, but how to understand the triggers of stress, and then how they can diffuse or de-escalate the stress in their life so that their kids can better understand and they can model the best way of dealing with stress.
There are a lot of resources in place for both children and parents experiencing child physical abuse. Within the school system, the Family Resource Center is fantastic. The school guidance counselor can be a wonderful resource. In the community, our community mental health centers are set up to receive clients and provide services for kids who have experienced physical child abuse, and also for their parents as well, to get treatment that they need to better and more safely parent their children.
Imagine a world without child abuse. There are things all of us can do in our work to prevent abuse and neglect from ever occurring. The best way to prevent child abuse and neglect is to build protective factors in families. These factors include parental resilience, or helping parents learn how to cope with stress and problem solve. Increasing supports for parents, encouraging friends, family, neighbors, faith-based communities, and more to offer parenting support and assistance to families. Ensuring families have basic needs. Improve parenting skills and knowledge of child development. And ensuring our children and youth learn the ability to interact positively with others, self-regulate their behavior, and understand ways to communicate their feelings.
Keeping these protective factors in mind, here are examples of how you can involve your school and community. Start parent education or support groups aimed at building protective factors in families. Educate parents and caregivers. Send home flyers regarding discipline, child development, and resources available to families within your community. Create awareness by hosting a Child Abuse Prevention Month campaign during April or any time of the year. Get involved in the Pinwheels for Prevention campaign. Improve collaborations within your community. Get the PTA or PTO and other community organizations involved in your prevention efforts. See what your Family Resource Center is doing. Stay connected, volunteer, and help promote programs aimed at supporting families. Get to know your students. Pay attention. You may be the only person that child feels they can trust or talk to.
At the end of the day, law enforcement and social services and the school all have different roles and different functions, but we are all very important to ensure that that child comes through the injury, the traumatic experience, in the best manner possible.
The most important thing I want to get across to teachers is if you are suspicious at all, or any school personnel, if you're suspicious at all that a child has been abused, don't worry about whether it meets criteria. Go ahead and call that in. Let someone who's more familiar with the law and with the acceptance criteria take that. I would much rather have 100 phone calls a day into central intake than to miss one child being physically abused.
I can't say that enough. Report. If you suspect, report. You don't have to investigate, and frankly, I don't want you to. I don't want you to be questioning that child. I don't want you to be building a case to think, okay, it's the 4th time he's come in with a black eye. Report the first time you see that suspicious injury, and maybe you can prevent the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th time.
I would encourage people to report because you may be the only one, the only advocate in that child's life who can protect them and keep them from future harm.
Let you as educators continue to have your relationship with them, because you could be one of the more stable, consistent figures in their lives.
For more information on recognizing, reporting, and responding to child abuse and neglect,
or for more about how you can prevent child abuse and neglect, please visit the Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky website at www.pcaky.org.